Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first seminar of 2017. Very fortunate to have Dr. Mark Hurst giving us the paper. Mark is Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Kent, based in the School of History. Mark read his contemporary history at the University of Leicester before going to Kent, and he has recently produced a monograph which is entitled British Human Rights Organisations and Soviet Dissent, 1965, which was published last year. And Mark is going to be talking to us today about, I'll let him read out the title because that's probably much better. So I'll hand it over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. So I'll be presenting today on the broad subject of It's All a Matter of Timing, Human Rights Activism, Soviet Dissent in the Cold War. Presenting an amalgam of kind of best part of 10 years' work of research onto human rights organisations, particularly in Britain focused, but I might sort of broaden out more internationally throughout the course of the paper and the impact that they've had. So, on the appropriately freezing morning of Saturday the 18th of December 1976, readers of the Daily Mirror were given the remarkable news of an event that changed the course of the Cold War. And sandwiched on page 8 of the newspaper, just underneath a story about the love life of Queen Park Ranger's Stan Bowles, and above this fascinating little article here on 6 mechanics who drank antifreeze out of a customer's car. It was actually a bottle of cherry brandy. I think 2 of them died rather grimly. Is a story that I think changes the way in which human rights was understood in the context of the Cold War. To zoom in a little bit more deeply, the article entitled Freedom for a Russian Rebel outlined how the Soviet Union had rather unexpectedly exchanged the political dissident Vladimir Bukovsky for the Chilean communist leader Louis Corvalán, an incredibly interesting manoeuvre in the broader political game of chess that was the Cold War at the height of détente. This exchange is particularly important for what it revealed about the Soviet Union. And to my mind, this is the first time that the Soviet Union admitted publicly that it was holding people prisoners for their political views, the first admission of a prisoner of conscience by the Soviet state. But perhaps more importantly, I think, it's an admission that it's willing to use these prisoners of conscience as political pawns to get what they want, exchanging them for very high-profile communist leaders from South America. In the arena of human rights and dissident politics, such an event taking place prior to Bukovsky's exchange in 1976 was seen as fancifully optimistic and absurd. Even when you compare it to events such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn's exile in 1974, this took place after years of political pressure against the writer from within the Soviet Union. And his exile was seen as a political act, I think, to remove this kind of dangerous time bomb from within the Soviet Union and get him out of the country, rather than revealing that he was himself a political dissident and part of a broader problem at the time. Bukovsky himself was exiled from prison, where he had been increasingly isolated from the broader dissident movement, both in the Soviet Union and the broader international networks that were developing at the time. And the Soviet penal system, to put it rather crudely, was very good at burying political opponents, either in the Gulag archipelago or in the even more brutal environment, Sikushki, psychiatric institutions where dissidents were defined as mentally unwell because of their political viewpoints. So moving Bukovsky from this closed environment into the broader international world was very, very telling about how things had changed in the course of the 1970s, highlighting a dramatic shift, I think, in the direction of the Cold War. Particularly, the Soviet authorities were now paying attention to what the international community thought about human rights and victims of human rights violations. This puts the broader context of activism that I've assessed in the 1960s and 70s and through into the 80s into a rather interesting position, I think. Campaigns in the West led by activists and non-governmental organisations from the mid-1960s onwards had been previously ignored, to my opinion. But something happens in the mid-1970s surrounding Bukovsky's release that their activism suddenly gains credibility and credence, and a number of organisations go from being fringe organisations to literally defining the news agenda of the day, with their activism taking place on the front page of national newspapers. Their activism begins to bear fruit in this period. So the aim of my paper this evening is to identify 3 major areas. I want to identify this transition from people not caring about human rights issues in a very broad sense in the 1960s, through to this strange event that happens in the 1970s where human rights becomes a thing in international relations. I want to focus particularly on British organisations and activism within Britain itself, particularly three major areas. The role of groups campaigning against the political abuse of psychiatry in the Soviet Union, where Britain gains particular expertise in the course of the 60s and 70s. The second major group are broadly defined as religious non-governmental organisations, people campaigning against the persecution of religious believers, be they Orthodox Christians, Methodists, Baptists, or the very wide Soviet Jewry movements campaigning to support Refuseniks wanting to leave the Soviet Union. And then finally, I want to talk about the Soviet campaigns of Amnesty International, an organisation that I think has been chronically understudied in the literature and something that might nod towards future directions for my research to come. And the second and third parts of this paper are probably going to be a bit briefer because of the depth of my work into these areas. I want to nod towards some of the rationale behind why this transition might have occurred from relative ignorance on human rights issues through to this centre stage effect that occurs from the mid-1970s onwards. And I want to explore a little bit about the broader importance of this transition and what it tells us about international politics at the time, nodding towards some of the broader impacts that I think these events have had. So let me begin with the rather cheery topic of psychiatric abuse. In the 1960s, it became increasingly effective for the Soviet authorities and the Soviet regime to not only dismiss the political views of political dissidents, but to declare them as mentally unwell, detain them in Psikhushki, Soviet very brutal slang for a psychiatric institution, and declare them unfit. And there's a number of cultural representations, both from the 60s, 70s and 80s, about how brutal this process is. Dissidents were forcibly treated for their illnesses and maladies with brutality on a number of levels. Insulin shock therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, all as a result of their political viewpoints rather than a definitive medical diagnosis. And in these institutions, most notably the Serbsky Institute in Moscow, which still operates to this day as a noted psychiatric institution, defined the rather mysterious sluggish schizophrenia, a mental disorder that was restricted to the Soviet bloc, not recognised by Western psychiatry, didn't stand up to any of the rationale at the time in the medical journals, and there were a number of psychiatrists in the West at the time demanding further medical evidence about what sluggish schizophrenia is. And when pushed, the leading protagonists, people like Andrei Snezhnevsky, the leader of the Serbsky Institute, said, "You have to train with us to understand these sort of things. It's only our skilled and top-notch psychiatrists that can identify the maladies from these seriously unwell patients." And lo and behold, everyone that suffered from sluggish schizophrenia had the typical traits of a dissident, not being unconformist, wanting to change things beyond their station, generally being sort of dissidents in their own sort of right. And the convenient nature of the Serbsky Institute at the centre of understanding of sluggish schizophrenia, to my mind, defines it as a non-medical condition, but rather a political tool moving in that sort of direction. Now, the first awareness of this abuse of psychiatry in the West occurred with the publication of Valery Tarsis's novel Ward 7, which, for those of you who might know of the works of Anton Chekhov, is a play on the term of novel Ward 6, in which Chekhov discusses how the doctor in charge of a mental asylum becomes a patient over time himself. Tarsis clearly tapping into that broader lineage of Dissent. Tarsis was a rather embittered Soviet author who failed to get any of his manuscripts published in the Soviet Union by any of the publishing presses, which were strongly controlled by the Soviet authorities. And in his frustrations, he turned to Tarmistat, literary publishing abroad, sending an underground manuscript through contacts to a Western publisher to translate and publish on his behalf, which the Collins and Harville Press do in 1962, publishing a novel of his called The Blue Bottle. And as a direct result of this publication, Tarsis was interned in a Psikhushki for seeking Western presses in a bourgeois approach of spreading his, whatever the Soviets defined it as at the time. And Ward 7 is a direct response to his experiences in Psikhushki, defining what his life was like in the institutions itself, and explores his experiences of being interned in this rather oppressive environment, to say the least. And much like The Blue Bottle, Ward 7 was picked up by the Collins and Harville Press, as it was then, in 1965, and serialised in The Observer. So I don't think this was something that was kind of buried away from publishing us. This was kind of widely read, serialised in a major national newspaper, so people were reading these sort of things. Particularly a couple of activists that I'll discuss later on were opened up to this new form of oppression within the Soviet bloc itself. But Tacitus's account from Ward 7 was given greater credence at the time by the persecution of Zhenya Belov, or Yevgeny as he was defined at the time. And in 1964, so shortly before this account in The Guardian was published, 4 British students travelled to the Soviet Union and met Yevgeny Belov, who acted as a diligent, state-approved translator and guide for one of the in-tourist trips that these students were on in their time in the Soviet Union. And the group befriended him. They didn't agree with him politically, but at the time they became very close to Belov as an individual. And they planned to visit him a year later. And when they returned to the Soviet Union for a similar trip, they noticed that Belov had changed in his political viewpoints. He was a bit more kind of critical of what the Soviet Union was doing and challenging some of the directions of the state at the time. And he'd recently been suspended by his local party organisation as a result of this shift in his political viewpoints. And the students thought this was rather curious, but decided to sort of carry on with their trip, going on to Tokyo afterwards, and planned to meet Belov on the way back to London. And lo and behold, at the pre-arranged meeting to meet Belov couldn't be found anywhere. And upon prying with contacts in Moscow at the time, they found out that Belov had been detained in Sikorsky as a direct result of his shift in political viewpoints. Now, these students, and rather entrepreneurially at the time, I think, returned to Britain and launched a kind of small-scale campaign on behalf of Belov. Yevgeny was adopted as an Amnesty prisoner of conscience at the time, and there was a minor amount of publicity on his behalf, mainly from The Guardian and The Observer, perhaps unsurprisingly, I think, given their support of Amnesty in the 1960s itself. And I still find it rather surprising that how small and minor this case was at the time, aside from a few comments in The Guardian. I mean, it makes it on page, so it's not completely buried, but this case disappears very, very quickly. And despite the students' effort, it disappears. And a similar pattern occurs with other high-profile cases, looking back on it now in hindsight, particularly the persecution of characters such as Petro Grigorenko, a Red Army general who dissents against the regime, ends up in Sikorsky. He has documentaries made about him by people like Leslie Woodhouse, published in the BBC. But again, there's no real response to what's going on. The same with Jules Medvedev, a scientist who rebels against Soviet policy towards science, Trofim Lysenko in particular, and the Stalinist abuse of agriculture in the Soviet Union. And again, Medvedev spends time in Sikorsky. There's a very short campaign on his behalf by Soviet dissidents, but the West don't respond to what's going on. And the same happens with Vladimir Bukovsky, the gentleman that I mentioned at the beginning. Early 1970s, people know that beyond The Guardian and The Observer, and to put it rather crudely, left-wing interested members of Amnesty, this didn't gain any traction at all in the 1970s. But it does in a certain variety of people, sectors. This gentleman here, Peter Redaway, an academic at the LSE at the time, a lecturer in government, focusing particularly on Russian and Soviet politics, takes this as a research interest at the time. He gains an academic interest in the mid-1960s following reading Tacitus's account, and develops an array of networks and contacts with the dissident movement themselves, gaining a huge amount of information over the years. And he sets up organisations, becomes an academic, really researching dissent and responding to the reports of abuse in the Soviet Union themselves. But even in 1971, when, and I still have no idea how Vladimir does this, Bukovsky manages to get hold of a tranche of medical documents from a psychiatrist, about 500-600 pages worth of the diagnosis documents referring to 6 major dissidents at the time, and he manages to smuggle them out to the West. And they form the basis of huge campaigns against the Soviet abuse of psychiatry at the time. And this kickstarts some activism. So Peter Redaway himself forms the rather snappily titled the Working Group on the Internment of Dissenters in Mental Hospitals. I'm sure they could have come up with something a little better here. But it's a small group, really, of academics, concerned psychiatrists, who use this information to petition psychiatric organisations around the world, particularly the World Psychiatric Association. They start putting pressure on international bodies, saying, we need to put pressure on the Soviet Union, this is unethical, we need to challenge what's going on and being allowed in the Soviet Union at the time. But the downside, I think, of the working group themselves is they're incredibly highbrow. It's very academic, it's very policy orientated, trying to change the very top of society, perhaps explaining why they don't get a huge amount of public reception at the time. And this leads to a split in the organisation, which occurs in 74, 75. It's kind of difficult to say given the nature of the group. But a splinter groups form from them called the Campaign Against Psychiatric Abuse, CAPA, which is an organisation that wants to take a much more active and more populist approach to the issue of psychiatric abuse. And it's driven by a dissident who manages to get himself out of the Soviet Union and settle in London, a chap called Viktor Feinberg, who had been interned in Quadski and wanted to tell the world about his experiences. And he was joined in his campaigns by the emigre psychiatrist Marina Wojcicka, who was a psychiatrist in one of these Sikorsky, who took active steps against her fellow psychiatrists to pull away from the persecution of individuals that she didn't think suffered from any form of mental illness, and she was directly persecuted as a result. Wojcicka somehow again manages to get an exit visa to move, but the Soviet authorities don't give permission to her son, Misha, who ends up spending 3-4 years afterwards trapped in the Soviet Union, living with his grandmother, as a direct attack, I think, on Wojcicka's deliberative leaving the Soviet Union and her campaigns that she conducts in the West. Now, CAPA are a fascinating group. To my mind, they seem rather active in street protests, in handing out literature, but their archival records are unbelievably scant. There is one folder of probably about 40 pages or so for their entire documentation, which tells you a huge amount to think about the organisation. Everything is done with like fact packets, let's get out in the streets, spread the message, let's not worry about archival material. And you kind of see the same thing with the working group. There's a lot of material, but it's still held in people's filing cabinets in their offices rather than actually put into serious repositories and preserved. So this is a huge issue I've had to deal with over the years. So I pretty much told you everything I know about both organisations to a certain extent. But what I think the group of these activists do is they start changing opinion towards what's going on, particularly regarding psychiatry in the Soviet Union. And to talk very, very broadly about these shifts, you can see this, I think, in the response from the World Psychiatric Association towards abuses in both the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc more broadly. The Soviet Union is at the, dare I say, the centre of psychiatric abuse at the time, but there are cases reported in Romania and Hungary at the time, but the Soviet Union seems to be the centre. And I think you can chart the impact that activism had and also this broad transition that I referred to through the World Psychiatric Association. So at their 1971 conference, World Congress even, that takes place in Mexico City, there is a complete reluctance to respond to the reports of Soviet abuse. It's pushed under the table, there's a general feel of upsetting the Soviets, and everything is directed, in my opinion, towards let's open up negotiation and collaboration rather than closing the door. And there are cases that take place after 71 where Western psychiatrists go to international conferences on schizophrenia in the Serbsky Institute in Moscow where dissidents are being interned. There's a real sense of let's not rattle the cage here. But by the time we get to 77 and the next World Congress in Honolulu, Bukovsky has been released. The Bukovsky documents have been circulated widely. There's a sense that these abuses are actually taking place. And the primary evidence exists for this. And you can see a shift in direction from the international psychiatric community. So in Honolulu, there's the signing of the so-called Declaration of Hawaii, which was passed incredibly narrowly. 90 votes in support, 88 votes against. And lo and behold, the Soviet bloc vote against, the Western bloc, speaking really broadly, vote for, and it passes on very, very slim margins. And this motion and the Declaration of Hawaii put direct pressure on the Soviet authorities, saying that we need to assess what's going on in the Soviet Union from an empirical point of view, and we need to track the cases of abuse and check that psychiatry in the Soviet Union is following modern ethics and modern practices more broadly. Most notably themselves, in Honolulu, the World Psychiatric Association form a review committee which is given the remit to respond to reports of abuse that are sent to them by national psychiatric organisations. So activists themselves couldn't send on documentation, but they could petition people like the Royal College of Psychiatrists or the American Psychiatric Association and say, I've had this report, can you send it on to the WPA, and get them to respond to it. So we get these channels forming about how pressure can be put on the Soviet authorities from a national psychiatric group onto the WPA, onto the Soviet authorities themselves. And given the Soviet lust for international prestige through science, this starts to bear fruit, I think. And the Royal College respond to this, that they know something's happening. So again, they formed the rather snappily titled the Special Committee on the Political Abuse of Psychiatry, SCAPAP, a wonderful acronym that doesn't really work themselves. And what is fascinating about SCAPAP as an organisation is, my impression is the Royal College look through its members and go, who has expertise on the Soviet Union and psychiatric ethics? And lo and behold, it's those psychiatrists that have been involved in Peter Redway's working group. People like Gerard Lobier, Sidney Block. These are activist psychiatrists, but they're also heavily involved in what the Royal College is doing in responding to reports of psychiatric abuse. So official psychiatry and activism starts blurring really, really heavily in the mid-1970s. And what I find fascinating looking through the documents of SCAPAP is these activists were not only advising, but they were drafting documents that were then published on behalf of the Royal College about psychiatric abuse. So a direct chain forms from activists through to official organisation itself. So following the events of 1977, this pressure on the Soviet authorities really started bearing through quite dramatically. So by the next conference in 1983 in Vienna, the mechanisms that had been set place in 1977 put a substantial amount of pressure on the Soviet authorities. And in order to save face, the All-Union Society of Neurologists and Psychiatrists, the Soviet psychiatric organisation, decide to withdraw from the WPA about 3 months or so before the conference takes place, basically to save face, because it becomes so clear that the pressure on them is so much that they need to resign in order to effectively avoid an international conference slagging them off left, right and centre. So I find this a fascinating transition. Why have we gone from a period where psychiatric concerns are pushed under the carpet to occupying the centre stage of international conferences? Similar things happen with religious organisations as well, the next part of the paper that I want to look at. I define these very broadly as religious NGOs. They have different motivations about them, but I think it encapsulates it nicely. And Britain becomes the home of expertise on groups concerned with the persecution of religious belief in the Soviet bloc. One group I want to focus on in particular is the Women's Campaign for Soviet Jewry. They're more commonly known really as the 35s, which I think tells you a lot about how they work as an organisation. So they gained this nickname, the 35s, from their very first protest, which was a hunger strike against the persecution of Riza Palatnik, a Refusnik who was living in Odessa. And in order to make a big splash about what's going on, the 35s decide, well, hang on, there's about 30 of us here, and we're all about 35. Oh, and Palatnik's 35 as well. I tell you what, we'll ring the newspaper, and every journalist we speak to, we will keep pushing this mantra of, we are 35-year-old campaigning for the 35-year-old Palatnik. And these numbers stick. When I've interviewed members of the 35s, they say, oh, we picked up this journalist from the Telegraph and heard in the background, oh, it's those damn 35s again. And it becomes a staple of the organisation, which tells us a lot, I think, about how desperate they are for media attention. They're so responsive to what journalists say that everything they do responds to, let's capture the public limelight. And that they're doing this in the early 1970s, before human rights becomes this big thing in international relations, taps again into the issues we see with the shift in psychiatry. So to give you a very brief sense of what the 35s do, they are desperate for media attention. My favourite of these are probably the photos in the top corners, ambushing Soviet tennis players at Wimbledon with a womble and big signs saying, how dare Russia persecute so-and-so. Strongman contests where Soviet athletes and weightlifters do very well flood the stage at key events too. There's journalists, photos are taken, it ends up in the newspapers. It's a remarkably clever tactic, and they manage to get reporting in the Times quite frequently in this period. They become a bit of a nuisance, but from their own accounts, the police seem to like them because of this. It makes what can be quite boring propaganda displays from the Soviet Union, dare I say, a bit of fun. And their entire history is laden with this. Let's have a bit of fun, but be serious at the same time to draw attention to what's going on. So there's cases of the 35s offering live, literal scapegoats outside the Soviet embassy, members of the organisation dressing up as huge pantomime elephants and stampeding into the offices of Aeroflot and Russian banks. There's a whole idea about a media spectacle here. They also become masters of the stage invasion. Any time there is a Soviet performance, be it the ballet, be it an orchestra, 35s would have got on the stage halfway through, umbrellas out with slogans, and generally trying to cause as much of a fuss as possible. And one of my favourite instances of this occurring is this image in the middle here, where in November 1972, a group of 35ers stormed the field at Selhurst Park when Zenit Leningrad were playing an exhibition match against Crystal Palace, and they start handing out leaflets to players on the pitch and people in the crowd, and there's just complete pandemonium, and you get these wonderful images where 35ers go up to bemuse footballers who are there purely on propaganda lines, that they've been completely hijacked by people in short skirts branding a leaflet. I mean, it's a fantastic tactic, to say the least. But this only works for a short period. 3 or 4 years or so, journalists get tired of this repeated, great, it's a Soviet display, when are they going to storm the stage? So the 35s have to adjust, and they do this in a variety of ways. So under the new leadership of Rita Ika and Margaret Eagle, Rita Ika and Margaret Eagle, the 35s recalibrate themselves towards becoming a serious human rights organisation, concerned about gaining information from the Soviet Union and distributing it in their it's quite an amateurish, but it's an incredibly information-laden newsletter. I mean, it's published on sort of newspaper, really thin onion paper, really, really poor quality, basically photocopied overnight. But for its time, it contained the most up-to-date information that was available on the persecution of Refuseniks. And when you dig a little deeper into this, the way in which they get this information is remarkable. So one of their key contacts of the group was a chap called Michael Sherborne, who was a Russian teacher, a school teacher in London, in East London, who decided a moral duty that every night he would phone the Soviet Union and try and get in touch with Refuseniks. He speaks Russian with a really, he spoke Russian with a very unusual accent. He makes it sound Lithuanian, so he used to fool people in the telephone exchange saying, "Oh, I'm the Lithuanian telephone exchange, can you connect me to this number?" And he used to have hour-long conversations with the Refuseniks that were being reported around the world. And he recorded all these conversations and sent them on to the 35s, who used them in their newsletters, which passed on to activists, politicians more broadly. So this organisation that was dressed up as pantomime elephants were now setting the international stage for huge campaigns for Soviet Jewry. Particularly notable when you look in the 35's papers, there's a number of letters from Thatcher at the time saying, your information is invaluable, keep sending stuff on to us, don't go through the channels, send it directly to Downing Street, we're really interested in what you have. And this is an organisation operating out of disused office spaces, former laundrettes that literally fall into pieces. It's remarkable how much of an influence they can have. One of Sherborne's major contributions, I think, was that in actually defining the term Refusnik, translating the Russian odkaznik from siruznik in Hebrew through into the English Refusnik, which has become the term we use to describe Refuseniks, Soviet Jews that couldn't get exit visas, but more broadly in the lexicon now as people that don't want to do things. But also I think what's fascinating about Sherborne himself is the contacts he makes with the Soviet dissident movement. It's remarkable the contacts he makes at the time. Phoning up Anatoly Sharansky most days, who was probably the leading figure in the Soviet Jewry movement, and Sherborne would happily have a 2-3 hour conversation with him. The first accounts of Sharansky's trial come to the West through a conversation that Sherborne had with Sharansky's brother. Sherborne contacts a newspaper journalist, it gets published, so on and so forth. So these informal networks develop really, really quickly. But it also works the other way around as well. And this photo, I've never been so happy to find a personal photo from Sherborne. I interviewed Sherborne about 3 or 4 years ago now, and he was showing me his family photos, and he came across this one of the Refusnik Ida Nudel. And to cut a very long story short, Nudel was really feeling the pressure of the persecution of the KGB at the time. So to lift her spirits, Sherborne managed to smuggle out a photo of himself on the phone, this photo here, out to Nudel. And in response, Nudel sent a photo of herself back to him, very prominently showing the photo of Sherborne himself. And this is a bold move at the time. Nudel was being monitored by the KGB, had her flat regularly searched, and bear in mind she had a photo of someone that the KGB and the Soviet press broadly proclaimed as the fascist Lord Sherborne. This is a really defiant move. I think it's so telling of the relationship that these activists developed behind the Iron Curtain. But again, we see this transition here. So people don't care about human rights issues early on, you have to dress up in silly outfits to get attention, and now politicians are craving the information you create. Similar things happen with another organisation I've been fascinated by in recent years. The Centre for the Study of Religion and Communism, or as they're more broadly known, Keston College. Keston College was driven by the Anglican priest Michael Bordeaux, who's seen up in the top right, giving a paper in 1984 at Church House, I think that is, right in front of Margaret Thatcher, I think, which neatly shows the links that these characters develop. Bordeaux developed a personal concern about the plight of religious believers in the Soviet Union after spending time in Moscow on the British Council Exchange in 1959, the first British Council Exchange that takes place between Britain and the Soviet Union. And he witnessed firsthand the anti-religious policies that were being conducted by Nikita Khrushchev, far more brutal than his predecessors, something that's often forgotten, I think. And Bordeaux takes it on as his own personal mission to campaign against the persecution of religious belief and to document what's going on. And it becomes his life religious mission to do so. He describes it as the moment where God grabs the steering wheel of my life and pushes me in this direction. And he goes to huge lengths. I mean, he sets an organisation that has no money and somehow manages to buy a disused school that goes through massive renovations, despite the fact they're constantly on the verge of bankruptcy throughout the 70s and 80s. And they gain a huge amount of credibility. They have a huge library of Samizdat, that is self-published dissident material that's smuggled out to them. And we're not talking pamphlets that are kind of smuggled out from the street, we're talking things like the Memorandum of the Lithuanian Catholic Church, which is now rightly revered as a huge religious relic by Catholics in Lithuania. It's this declaration of independence. And their holdings today, which are now at Baylor University in Texas, are still rightly regarded, I think, as the most notable on religious persecution in the Soviet Union. So Keston's purpose compared to the 35s, although it's similar, it's about this collection of material. It's much more academic and scholarly in nature. They want to become the international intellectual powerhouse of dissent from a religious point of view. But again, like psychiatric groups like the 35s, they gain virtually no public interest in the early 1970s. But after 76, 77, people start getting interested in what they're doing. And after 1906, Bordeaux himself gets invited to Downing Street on a number of occasions. He takes part in 1984 in the infamous Chequers Summit that Thatcher calls shortly before Gorbachev comes to power. And Bordeaux has told me, and I've seen documentary evidence of this, that the first list of individuals that were drawn up by the FCO and the civil servants surrounding Thatcher were crossed out, and Bordeaux's name was put down personally by Thatcher after she'd heard radio interviews with Bordeaux saying, he's the man I want at the table. This shows a lot of recognition, I think, in Keston's work and how venerated Bordeaux's information was at the time. Bordeaux also received the Templeton Prize in 1984, the year after Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, again reiterating the international impact that I think his work has had. Now I'm still aware of time, so the final group that I want to assess is perhaps the most notable regarding human rights more broadly in Amnesty International. Amnesty's activism for Soviet prisoners of conscience was particularly tricky, I think, in the Cold War. Amnesty gains its power, I think, because of its ability to say that it's impartial. It has no political viewpoint beyond we're protecting prisoners of conscience around the world, regardless of what they think. But doing this in the Cold War is incredibly difficult because you're open to so much persuasion on both sides of saying, well, you would say that, but you're focusing on the Soviet Union or the US and so on and so forth. So Amnesty has to walk this very, very, very tricky tightrope throughout, particularly for supporting communist prisoners of conscience, people that have been members of the party through wanting to progress or through their own political viewpoints, because a central tenement of communist belief is that you want worldwide revolution, which may necessitate violence. Amnesty publicly says it will not support any prisoner of conscience that advocates violence. So there's a stick that could be beaten, that Amnesty could be beaten with there quite easily. So it has to tread relatively carefully throughout. But despite this, it manages to take part in some rather bold moves for the time, I think. In the early 1970s, it manages to get hold of translated versions of the infamous Soviet Samizdat journal, the Chronicle of Current Events, which is the number one source of information for life in the Soviet Union regarding dissidents. It's a very dry and to the point underground document that lays out the reports of persecution. And what's remarkable about the Chronicle is that it is so unemotional. Accounts will say, today so-and-so was followed for 10 minutes by KGB members, and the trial will take place in 3 months' time. It doesn't have that edge that a lot of underground political documents have with rhetoric or political intrigue or in a debate. It's just setting the facts out, which gives it a huge amount of power in the context of the Cold War. And Amnesty describe this as a really, really rich document that they want to publicise more broadly. Interestingly, Amnesty get copies of the Chronicle via Peter Reddaway, the gentleman I mentioned earlier working at the LSE. Reddaway edits, translates, and sends on all this material directly to Amnesty, and how he gets this material I still don't really know to this day, despite pushing him on it. My sense is that a lot of it comes either through the diplomatic bag, through contacts, either students, tourists coming back from the Soviet Union, smuggling this material out and passing it on to me, passing it on to him. And I know there are certain instances where journalists would have contacts with dissidents. It would come off the typewriter, go into the suitcase, they get on a flight, pass to Peter Reddaway the next day, translated straight to Amnesty. So another flow of information develops rather quickly. But in the context of the Cold War, Amnesty publishing this material under its own name as well, which I think is something really important to note. They don't hide it as a Dissent material, they say it's one of their own publications. Really marks their colour to how much they want to support this material. And as a result of this, Amnesty internally are desperate to find a similar type of publication from a right-wing regime. So they go scouring through Latin America, Chile, they obsess over trying to find a similar thing in Chile at the time. But it doesn't exist. The Chronicle, I think, is unique for its time, and that causes a number of headaches for Amnesty about whether they should publish it or not. They try and palm it off onto Writers and Scholars International, the group that now publishes Index on censorship, but Index only publish it on the proviso that it's published as an Amnesty publication, so there's some huge ideological issues going on at this time. Amnesty's position in the Cold War was also further complicated by the fact that Soviet dissidents rather like Amnesty's work. So in the early 1970s, a group of dissidents led by Andrei Tverdokhlebov form a branch of Amnesty in Moscow, which, as you can imagine, the Soviet authorities really are not happy with at all, despite the fact that this branch don't do any campaigning on behalf of Soviet dissidents. So Amnesty at the time had the work on own countries rule, which is that you couldn't conduct activism for cases that took place in the country in which you were living, regardless of the Soviet authorities wanted nothing to do with this, and they hounded and persecuted those that were even affiliated to those involved in the Amnesty group itself, which complicates what Amnesty is doing at this time. And they never fully recognised the Moscow group as a legitimate part, more of a corresponding member rather than a fully fledged national organisation itself. Now, in the broader history of Amnesty itself, it's easy to think that their activism throughout is seen as kind of noble and changing the world, but the reality, as Tom Buchanan has put beautifully in some of his work, that prior to 1976-77, no one cared. Amnesty's work was really pushed under the carpet beyond what's going on with The Observer and dare I say, the people that are interested in what's going on. And I think you can see this really clearly in the reports that surrounding when it wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977. The group, rather rightly I think, hold it up as this great defining moment for the organisation, where it's held as this kind of huge international status that Amnesty is doing something. But the press reports at the time completely overlook the fact that Amnesty won the Peace Prize in 1977. The letter even confirming the award to the organisation gets sent to a hopelessly out-of-date address, and Amnesty only find out that they've been awarded the award by a report buried on about page 12 of The Observer or something. The focus is not on Amnesty in the slightest, it's on other. So 77, 2 Nobel Peace Prizes are awarded, and 2 Northern Irish campaigners campaigning against the Troubles get all the headlights. Amnesty is buried really down the newspapers themselves. So there's an interesting sort of mismemory of history here, I think, with Amnesty saying it's the big moment in their career, but at the time, no one cared about them. And I think that's a really interesting point that I'd like to develop further in the future. One of the interesting things that's one of the major issues that Amnesty has to deal with post-77 is how does it respond to this new international stage? I mean, despite the fact no one cares really about them winning the Peace Prize in 77, by 78, 79, the organisation gets absolutely bombarded by media requests. And their internal archives are laden with reports of researchers saying we are overworked, we can't even keep up to date with what we're meant to be doing, let alone be innovative and translate documents, and the turnover of staff is dramatic. They're reliant on volunteers and people willing to go above and beyond because they're interested rather than having a centrally committed core of researchers like they have now. And I think that Amnesty tries to rely on its impartiality, its power to step aside from the ideological conflict at the time and say, look, we're impartial, we're not ideologically involved, we just say things as they are. But to do this at the time when they're publishing things like the Chronicle and clearly engaging in what's going on in the Cold War, it's a remarkably difficult tightrope to walk in the period itself. And you can see there's some odd actions that take place in the late 70s where Amnesty is clearly trying to justify itself ideologically. So in 1979, Amnesty appointed Derek Roebuck as its Director of Research, something that would usually just pass off without mention, but Roebuck was a former member of the Communist Party of Australia and had published a number of articles attacking the US for the North Korean press, bizarrely enough, and had written in a number of publications that the death penalty was justified on certain occasions. Quite ironic for someone to now be heading up Amnesty's research department. And a number of very senior members of Amnesty's management go, what's going on? Most notably, Edward Klein, who is at the time and later on was a personal friend of the Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov, and a very senior member of Amnesty International's US board, says, I have to resign. I cannot work for an organisation that is appointing these sort of individuals to these prominent positions. But national organisations in Germany, in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands like this appointment because they say it proves we're impartial. We can have former communist members actively taking a leading role in our organisation. Again, I think this really highlights that tightrope that Amnesty's got to walk. And again, Amnesty's not dealing with this in the 60s or early 70s. Post-75, post-76, you have to appoint communists to prove that you're a legitimate organisation or prove that you're not engaging in the Cold War. Something fishy happens in this period. So now I want to kind of nod towards why some of these things might have happened. Some more obvious, some a little bit, I'm still playing with ideas myself. Why do we go from a period, early 1970s, people are being interned in Sikorsky and abused and no one cares. 77, 78, it's the mainstay of the international climate. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. It's the first and perhaps most noted in the literature is the Helsinki moment. So in 1975 we have the Helsinki Accords. People come to the table and say, look, human rights is something we can push. Basket 3 arguably sneaks in human rights provisions that the Soviet Union have to sign up to. And this is something I won't go into too much detail because other scholars have done this so much better than I can in the 2 or 3 minutes I want to cover this. Sarah Snyder's book in particular is fantastic on covering the Helsinki movement and the broader networks that come into this. And she rightly notes that historians have generally underestimated the role of human rights advocacy and the influence of the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, which was the culmination of 3 years of negotiations on the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe. She argues that the transnational Helsinki networks formed to push for nations to adhere to the principles of Basket 3, so these international provisions set in place. So perhaps the transition we see in the late 1970s is just the international community responding to these new international laws and saying, right, we have the procedures in place that we can actually engage with these issues more broadly. She notes that the environment had been created where it became commonplace for an Eastern European dissident to write to an American diplomat asking that his plight be addressed in upcoming talks, or for an American-Polish activist to press the Polish ambassador to the United States, to free trade organisations, and so on and so forth. So the mechanisms get set in place. Now, I like that as one thing, but I think there's still more to it than this. Just because the framework is there doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be followed. There has to be more to this. And I think Barbara Keyes taps into this next development slightly more. She argues in her recent book, which again I highly recommend, Reclaiming American Virtue, that America undergoes a moral crusade almost in the mid-1970s. Following the debacle of the Vietnam War, America needs to do something on the international stage to say, look, we're not the bad guys. We want to do something that's morally pure. We need to reclaim our sense of virtue on the international stage. So she points particularly to the efforts of Jimmy Carter as saying that human rights is a way of doing this. If you have these principles, you can say that it's not about US aggression or about imperial ideas or about the proclamation of soft power. It's about the protection of individuals based on morality. And her work really neatly shows that people in the State Department, in the White House, suddenly go, human rights. Oh, I need to do a bit of reading on this. What is this new concept? It hadn't been explored before. And it's immensely powerful for its day. And it repositions the way that the US is trying to engage in the world. I think this has knock-on effects to what's going on in Britain, what's going on in Western Europe, responding to this issue of morality now becoming centre stage in international politics. And we only have to think of Reagan's evil empire moment to see the logical conclusion of what starts in the mid-1970s. Rosemary Foote puts it in her rather good chapter on human rights in the Cambridge history of the Cold War, that by the late 20th century, the promotion and protection of human rights has become a major part of the fabric of a modern and legitimate state. There's a huge transition there, I think, that needs to be identified, that human rights is now about statehood, it's about legitimacy and authority, all these big issues that didn't exist before. Another issue that has been dominating the literature surrounding the history of human rights is the work driven largely by Samuel Moyn, the professor of legal history at Harvard, who has rather convincingly argued about the birth of human rights, as he puts it, in the 1970s, where the human rights occupies this position as a last utopia. The utopians of communism and capitalism sort of die away, and human rights ideals fill this moral vacuum as something that could be tapped towards, that people can get their belief system behind almost. He argues that over the course of the 1970s, the moral world of Westerners shifted, opening a space for the sort of utopianism that coalesced in the international human rights movement that had never existed before. The drama of human rights, then, is that they emerged in the 1970s seemingly from nowhere. I think he puts this quite strongly, but nevertheless it's quite a convincing argument. Why do we have international human rights legislation take place in 1948, famously with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then we have a blossoming of human rights activism in the 1970s? There's got to be some sort of overlap here itself. This is quite a controversial view, I would think, and many scholars in the field of human rights have disagreed with Moyn's views quite pointedly, saying, well, human rights has always been there, it's just something happens in the 70s. And there's furious debates in past and present at the moment by Lynn Hunt and Stefan Luke Hoffman about whether there are different moments where this blossoming and birth of human rights happens. But I find it rather convincing, looking at the Soviet dissident movement, that something happens in the mid-70s that generates this. So perhaps altogether, the Helsinki moment, the broadening desire for US morality and foreign policy, the last utopian vision of the mid-70s, something's going on here, I think. But more broadly, I think this research touches on a number of issues that I will cover very, very briefly. Most notably, the role of NGOs and expertise. This is something that Matthew Hilton, Nick Crowson, and people at Birmingham and QM have spoken about very, very much more eloquently than I can. The politics of expertise developing as a thing during the course of the 20th century, that perhaps the 1970s is a moment where people start trusting activists more than politicians, and that the mid-1970s we see the moment where it transitions. Alongside changes in the Cold War, we just get this moment of critical mass, perhaps. Again, I think this feeds into it really neatly, and given developments in recent years, there's something about expertise that I think could be tapped into about why are activists in the late 1970s trusted more than politicians. There's something to pick out there. The other thing I wanted to tap upon was the power of networking, the flow of information. In the couple of examples that I've given you this evening, there's some fascinating insights into how dissidents can open up flows of information that completely bypass the rigid iron curtain that develops in 1945. Suddenly passing on a piece of psalmistat to a journalist or a diplomat, brown bag, onto an activist in the West, and then it gets published internationally. That's a very, very powerful tool for dissidents to utilise. It's something that Margaret Keck and Catherine Sekinka wrote about in their wonderful book Activists Beyond Borders in 1998, but I think this period in the 70s really shows how useful it is, and Mark Granovetter's work on the strength of weak ties I think is something that can be tapped into here, about how activists must have bumped into each other on protests and must have had personal interactions with each other. And I know Michael Bordeaux and Peter Redder have become really close friends, so their relationships across religious persecution and psychiatric persecution come together. Information must have been shared. There's something here about a different insight into the Cold War, I think. So to offer some sort of conclusions to what I hope you see as a really broad period history that I really have skimmed over in the time of today, I want to flag up some of the contemporary parallels with this work that I think really show the value of the research that I've conducted, but also how important this is. So in recent years alone, there have been a number of issues where there have been so many strong parallels with the work that I've conducted from the 1970s, coming back again and again. The assassination of Boris Nemtsov a few years back, 100 metres or so from the Kremlin, and the protests that follow on from this show that the dissident movement hasn't gone away. The case of Mikhail Kosenko, which took place after the Bolotnaya protests in 2011, Kosenko himself was interned in a psychiatric institution, and the diagnosis behind his psychiatric evaluation is suspicious, to say the least. And the number of reports that I've seen in recent years about sluggish schizophrenia returning to Russian textbooks, and the Serbsky engaging in a number of activities similar to what happened in the 1960s again is alarming, to say the least. The case of Piotr Pawlenski, again, really typifies this. You may know Pawlenski as the performance activist involved in groups like Wojna. He made headlines around the world for nailing his scrotum to Red Square to highlight the oppression he felt he was under. But one of Pawlenski's most noted performance pieces, I think, is where he climbed onto the roof of the Serbsky Institute and in Van Gogh style chopped one of his ears off in protest about the changes in psychiatric evaluation that are going on in the Soviet Union, in Russia at the time. And lo and behold, Pawlenski has been interned in psychiatric institutions against his will because he's been dubbed mentally insane, following this protest where he rather boldly threw a can of petrol onto the headquarters of the FSB and set lights to these very iconic doors. He's a bold man, to say the least, and in preparing this paper he's appealed this morning for asylum in France, or is in the process of appealing for asylum because lo and behold, he and his wife have been allegedly involved in a case of rather violent rape, which they both strenuously deny, saying that it's a political move against them. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of this, it's still really fresh in the mind, but given the history of what's going on here, it stinks, to my mind, from what I've seen to date. And the case that's perhaps most notable in the Western world is the case of Pussy Riot, who took part in these remarkably bold protests in the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, where they stormed in front of the iconostasis, the most holy part of the cathedral, and took part in a punk prayer proclaiming that the Lord's shit, and saying that Putin needs to be overthrown and needs to become a feminist. And they were in turn sent to labour camp for what's going on. But what I find fascinating about Pussy Riot from my own work is that of their leading characters, now there's Tolo Konakova is the one that really stands out. And she in media interviews she's given, notably with The Guardian again, we were talking about the same newspaper, says that her inspirations for her activism are dissidents such as Anatoly Marchenko and Vladimir Bukovsky. We've returned full circle here. The dissidents of the 1970s are inspiring a new generation of dissent, and I wonder if we're going to see a different transition as we saw in the 1970s. Will we see another moment in the years to come where these dissidents go from being a fringe issue that's sometimes reported but never at the centre and become centre stage again? I think with the election of Trump and the rapprochement between the US and Russia in recent years, I think this may be some time off. But who knows? We could see a moment where things change rather dramatically. Thank you very much for your time, Steve.